and it's over the top of a multi-million-dollar Russian Buk. And somehow they hadn't figured out at that point how to see drones. Next slide, please. This is an exercise for an ISIS drone, and how to defeat these, and they come in all categories. Next slide. This is a faceplate from a drone found on a battlefield, and it's a Russian make. And the question is, do we really need countermeasures on drones? Next slide. This is a list that was about a year old when we made it up, and it's 20 different drones found on the battlefield in Ukraine that are Russian drones. So essentially, we have a lot of different drones out there with a lot of different radios and a lot of different frequencies. Next slide. This is our last slide to orientate this discussion, but this is a Korshuka 4, which is about a 300-kilometer range, and it can change GPS at will, and it can jam. So this was on a hillside in Syria. So with that, I'm going to have our panel introduce themselves, starting with my left, and
take it away.
Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Skip. I'm Jeff McChesney. I'm a former Air Force colonel, F-15 combat fighter pilot. I've got engineering degrees from the Air Force Academy, Columbia University, and I'm a Harvard National Security Fellow. I'm in the AFWERX today, representing Target Arm, which I'm bringing in a new invention called Talon for universal launch and release of UAVs for security forces.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, I'm Adam Robertson. I'm with Fordham Technologies, where I am the Chief Technology Officer. My specialty is in very small size, weight, power, cost, performance radar systems. We build radar systems for detecting drones and also Blue Force interceptors for drone-on-drone defeat. We have active contracts with DARPA's Mobile Force Protection effort and also with Air Force Research Labs on their Blue Force interceptor technologies.
My name is Dan Meiji, and I'm the founder of Citadel Defense Company based out of San Diego. We are an RF-based, machine learning-powered, all-in-one detect, identify, categorize, mitigate system. We were originally designed for sports stadiums. That's the world I come out of. And then the SOF community found us about a year ago and started deploying our stuff to active battle zones around the world. We have half a dozen domestic and federal government and DoD customers, and our specialty is the low cost, commercially available off-the-shelf technology drones, mitigating those.
Hey everyone, my name is Byron Garvin. I'm the general manager of Spotter RF. Spotter RF is a radar in a backpack manufacturer. So we started out doing ground detection for military, elite special forces in the military. We've been fielded downrange for about 8 years now. And over the last few years, we've identified that the threat of drones, the small UAS systems is huge. So we've adapted our technology and we've created a 3D dome radar system to track a drone in the airspace around and to be able to track that drone with the camera and mitigation techniques like jammers or weapon systems.
Thank you. I'll do myself last, Skip Parish, and I'm essentially an SME in drones, counter drones, Russian electronic warfare weapons, and we don't produce anything other than whatever the government eats. Let's take a stab at a question here. Let's take a look at what changes in UAS's technology have happened in the last 4 years. What do you think the top three, and I'll start on my left here, the top three technology changes are?
You want me to just take one or take all three?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just start with one. I think that the thing that's happening most, in my opinion, is kind of like what's happened with electronic countermeasures over the last 30 or 40 years. And that is that the complexity and the ability of each individual component, in this case the UAVs, on both sides are increasing. And as they continue to increase, you start moving into developing countermeasures, and that's where the counter UAS is coming in. and then we're going to get in the cat and mouse game, and it's starting very, very rapidly now, of now having countermeasures. So we're going to have UCAV capabilities, and then they're going to counter back with the other side. So I think the first thing is that the evolution in the technology is accelerating extremely fast now, as the proliferation of drones are increasing and the payloads are changing with them. And I think that the doctrine is lagging behind over the last couple of years to catch up to that. So let me stop there and let someone else contribute.
All right, sir.
Yeah, I want to speak to just more general trend that I see in changes of UAS technology. And what I see there is a consumer-driven commercialization. There's massive amounts of funding going into this because it's available commercially. Now, you can buy a very sophisticated DJI Mavic Pro at your local Costco, and it's within a consumer price range. People are buying these for fun, and then you get into a category where you have careless, clueless, and criminal operators, and figuring out who is cluelessly operating, who's just careless, doesn't know what they're doing, and who's criminal, and those are difficult to determine.
Yeah, to kind of piggyback on that response, I think that what we see is a incredible increase in the precision of the protocols that are coming out of the commercial drones. If you look at, Lightbridge 2 versus OcuSync, it's incredible how different they are. And I think because the commercialization of drones is driving a big industry, you're seeing commercial technologies, in a sense, outpacing some of the military products that are on the market, which means that, the bad guys, if you will be buying commercially available off-the-shelf technology and deploying it because it's cheap. It's really, really good. It has a 4K camera. That's something we all need to talk about for a surveillance perspective. And, at the end of the day, it's not a $100,000 drone. So if you break it, it's not a big deal for these folks.
I think you guys did a pretty good job answering. The only thing I wanted to add there was just the fact that something that a kid plays with now could potentially become actually a major impact in a warfighting situation is pretty unique, I think. I don't know if we've experienced something like that in our history in the same way. And camera technology, I think, is probably one of the biggest drivers of that. If you don't have the resolution and the ability to see, then no matter the control that you have, you're not able to actually utilize that technology to do what you want it to do. That along with just the fact that, just like you said, all of the components are becoming much cheaper and much higher quality, then the precision of these systems are phenomenal and very cheap.
Thank you. We're next going to look at threats, but just as a footnote, the first drones that we detected in the evolution of drones was at Guadalcanal back in World War II. And they took some regular planes and essentially hooked them up to make drones. If we have Moore's Law in this, and technology doubles every 7 years, what are our threats now? And what are your thoughts on what our biggest threats will be? Colonel?
Yeah, in my mind, I think that it's going to be an asymmetric threat. We don't know what's coming at us. In that manner, we're going to put assets against some utility of some simple drone, so some design that we think is just, it's ubiquitous and it's easy to buy. And it's going to be used in a completely asymmetric way that we hadn't thought about. Delivering chemical weapons over the top of you, being able to put weapons on and weaponize a little drone that's carrying, a half-a-pound payload, shape charges, and how they're going to be utilized are all very, very scary in my mind. So asymmetric threats.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I just want to pitch in a couple of thoughts in terms of thinking about the threats. I think we need to categorize the type of threats. You have very sophisticated state actors. These are nation states. These have a lot of money they can put into it. They're very sophisticated, and they're going to throw threats at us that are very difficult to categorize, very difficult to understand, and are not very predictable. You have another group which is a little less sophisticated, but still has some sophistication, which are more the terrorist type. They want something that's very cheap, very fast, adaptable. They're likely to utilize what's already off the shelf commercially and adapt it to their terrorist needs. And then we have rogue individuals who can do things. And then yet another one, as I mentioned, the kind of careless, clueless. We have people who are serious threats to aviation just because they don't know what they're doing. They're flying close to airplanes. I live in the state of Utah. In the month of May alone, there were 7 times where a pilot reported in his airspace flying illegally small drones. One of those was a passenger jet. It was a SkyWest flight. So we have some serious threats from a broad spectrum of actors.
Yeah, I think you guys have done a great job of talking about what the main threats are. I think one thing we need to do, if we're talking about the asymmetric piece of that, is characterize it as a ground fight that's moved up, not an air fight that's moved down. And what I mean is that people will take these commercially available off-the-shelf drones, deploy them, and in a matter of minutes be done with their whole action, and then either retrieve it and walk away, which means it can be difficult in certain situations to treat this like an aircraft from a tracking, from an identification standpoint. We have to realize that because these drones are so easily used and deployed, we have to think in an asymmetric manner if we want to counter them.
Well, so in addition to the drones being a threat of unknown unknowns, the biggest issue I see is that our current security measures are typically oriented towards the ground, right? We have your facilities, your critical facilities are guarded by these tall fences because typically people can't get over those fences very easily. But now you've got a drone that can just hop right over that fence and you can do who knows what you want to do with it. And that will continue to evolve. So until we're able to improve our security measures towards that type of threat, I think we're going to be vulnerable.
Thank you. We want to get back to the camera comment that you made a little bit, but let's look at counters right now on these. And if you're on a battlefield with a sophisticated enemy who had certain electronic warfare equipment, no longer can you have RF emissions and GPS as a counter. So countermeasures come and go. They're based on the counter of the counter. So we're looking for passive detection. Passive detection is now rising to the top of the table and is a hot technology. So if we look back on this a little bit, what sort of counters will we have? Do some of your panelists have some ideas on those right now and in a year from now?
Dan, you want to take that one?
Sure. So I guess as the only person who has a passive detection system, I'll start with that. I think on the near-to-peer side of things, if you look at Eastern Europe, and we looked at a lot of slides, the Russians have developed some incredibly sophisticated EW systems. A lot of the stuff we've been basically told is the second you turn on something that emits, within 30 seconds there'll be an artillery shell that hits that emitter. And it's a pretty, far kill zone. I mean, Skip, you can add more color to that. But what we've done at Citadel is invested heavily in what you might call narrowband jamming, but we call it, time sync engagement, so that you can use low emissions, like low wattage of power, to disrupt a control link. And that's something we're going to continue to invest very heavily in as a company, because we think that it gives us two advantages. First off, we can engage a drone without bringing down Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, and that's a big deal. In the world I came from in sports, people would rather die than lose their Wi-Fi. I heard that again and again and again, and it's absurd, but Instagram is very important for a lot of people. And the second thing that low impact mitigation does for us is it allows us to hopefully mask where our systems are, or at least keep the people who are deploying them safer.
Okay, thank you. I'm just interested on the radar side, whether or not there's any spoofing on the radar, or what you see ahead of us for countermeasures in that area.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, essentially the radar lights up, so we have a beacon out there on the battlefield. And is there any way to mask that? Any new delivery of that radar image?
Sure. Well,
any way to
I guess
to
depending on
what
what your scenario is, I think, right? You've got a lot of different scenarios where lighting up is an issue. There are lots of scenarios where it's not as much of a problem. Well, from SpotRF's perspective, the way that we approach that is based off of the output power and the frequencies that are used. We use a very, very narrow bandwidth of frequency, and we output at less than 1 watt of power. It's very difficult to detect unless you have very sophisticated technology in a close range. So while yes, you have issues with lighting up the battlefield in some scenarios, there are many, many other scenarios that you don't have that issue. And even when you do have that issue, I think it's much more difficult to detect than probably people realize.
Thank you. Do we want to visit anything about the cameras you mentioned earlier?
From a how they changed the battlefield perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things when we first got approached by the Special Forces community at large is that, they pulled out an Instant Eye, which is a small drone. It's this big. It maybe costs 10 to 15 grand. And then, you didn't really have a good, some of the operators didn't really like it because you couldn't see very well where you were flying. I mean, the pixels on it were not very good. And so what they would tell us is they would be deploying with Phantoms, right, and Mavics because they have a 4K camera. And I think that you're seeing now our near to peer. I mean, there's open source stuff that's saying that a lot of the folks in Russia and in Ukraine are flying Mavics now because they're this big and they have a 4K camera. And I mean, that is a fundamental change to what we've seen on the battlefield for a long time.
They're cheap.
They're
right?
so cheap.
Backpack and everything, right?
Yeah, exactly. You could put 3 or 4 in a backpack if you wanted, right?
Yeah,
And-
you fly them wherever you want and don't worry about recovering them.
Exactly. And so, I think that leads to a comment you made earlier, which is super important. We have to rethink the way we look at security because for thousands of years we built walls and moats and fences to keep people out, and now you can fly stuff right over that. And if you don't care about the price point because it's so small and you'll ditch it when you're finished, it's just a fundamental change to how we're going to fight on the battlefield.
We're at the edge of our time period now, and I'd like to ask each of our panelists to make a projection for next year. And what do you think will be the hot topic next year?
The hot topic in the U.S. or international, I guess would be my question.
Well, you could you take a stab at either one. So.
I think in our national airspace, we're going to see the huge proliferation of the commercial drones into the public marketplace is going to have unintended consequences. That the counter UAS is going to need to be there to protect the people, whether it happens to be a sports stadium or anywhere you've got an aggregation of people. There are going to be threats that are unintended and intended. Back to your criminality discussion as well. And I think that's going to be the thing that's going to drive the counter UAS in the U.S.
Thank you. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think of this very, very simply. If you think about, we don't talk, cars, automobiles, trucks can be used as a terrorist threat, as a weapon. We don't talk about counter-car technology, and that's not how we term it. That's not how we think about it. We think about integration of commercial drones into the national airspace. The question, we in the United States at least, rely on the rule of law. I don't walk down the street worried that a car is going to jump off the road and run over me. They could. It'd be very easy to do. I'm not worried about a car ramming into this building. Is that a real threat? Yes. What kind of barriers do we set up? This building has nothing. If you looked outside, it'd be very easy to ram a car into this building. So when you think about UAS commercial technologies, in the United States, we're going to be relying on the rule of law. We will be thinking through how do you monitor and measure those drones just like cars. You need to have policemen, you need to have rules of the road, you need to have speed limits, and then you need means of detecting violators and enforcing that. I think the discussion the following few years in the United States as we introduce commercial drones will be about how do we integrate nicely. We in the United States rely on that rule of law, and that will be the discussion.
Can we have our next panelist? Do we have a quick summary? What our hot topics will be next year?
My thought is that I think the number game is going to catch up to us. We're going to have a drone run into an airplane, or someone drop something into a stadium that's dangerous besides pamphlets.
All right.
And I think that'll fundamentally change the discussion.
Right.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's my thoughts as well. We're going to have some high-profile incident. I also think that along with that, maybe even in conjunction, swarms is going to be a major thing that will be discussion over the next few years as Disneyland becomes It replaces their fireworks with drones, and we have all of these different swarming capabilities. That's going to become much more
I'm glad you said that.
impactful.
That's my bet. We're going to have swarms of small drones, some weaponized, some essentially surveillance
Sure, a single
drones.
drone with a small payload is
Right.
not going to have much impact, but 1,000 of them, or even 100 of them with a small payload, could have a pretty significant impact.
I'd like to thank our panelists for their time and their insights into this, and thank you very much.
Good.